And there is a lot that the government is clearly trying to do to turn the situation around. But is it working? Tonight I'm joined by Jack Hadfield, a journalist who's covered the migrant crisis extensively, and the former editor of the Labour List website, Peter Edwards. Peter, we're going to start with you. This is a set of figures that likely no government would want to see, the highest number of asylum seekers on record.
Well, it's what no government would want to see, and it's what no government would want to inherit. I was amazed when I heard Chris Philp, the Tory frontbencher, complaining about it, having been the last government. You know, he really is the arsonist who complains the fire brigade aren't turning up sufficiently quickly. It's a nonsense. I don't want to bombard you with stats, but you know, just a couple. The Home Office are processing asylum claims much quicker than previously, and the asylum backlog has about halved over the last year or two. But it is a mess, and it's going to take a while to turn it around. But I think we've got to be clear that this comes from 14 years of Conservative government, and the public are rightly frustrated, but it's going to take time to work it out.
Before we get on to Jack, isn't there just an issue here with trying to speed run through the asylum backlog? Because obviously the fastest way to end an asylum claim is to grant that asylum claim. If you refuse that asylum claim, well, that could go for rounds and rounds of appeals. That could elongate the process. The incentive structure for any system that is told to get that asylum claim list down is to approve as many as possible.
One thing that unites us is being British and believing in fairness, and anyone is entitled to fair treatment by the criminal justice system. If you or I were accused of a crime, we would expect to be treated fairly with a case done on its own merits, not to suit a kind of macroeconomic agenda. But there is a particular issue around the number of judges and courts for asylum appeals. We all know there were court closures under the coalition. My understanding is Labour are trying to increase the number of judges and speed up the number of appeals for exactly the reasons you set out.
And let's bring in Jack Hadfield now, a journalist who's covered these migrant story extensively. And Jack, you've been at many of these hotels in recent months, recent weeks, that have seen protests proliferate across the country. We learned today in the latest data that the number of migrants living in hotels has risen, not fallen this year. It's risen by 8%.
Yes, exactly. You know, we're seeing these numbers increasing, even though, of course, the government wants to move away from hotels towards more HMOs, you know, scattered and separated from one central location. But of course, that hasn't actually stopped the protests. When there was a protest in Nuneaton a few weeks ago, that was after a case involving residents allegedly in one HMO. But yeah, I do just want to agree with Peter as well on one thing, that this has been a result of 14 years of Conservative government. It was the Boris wave after 2020 when, you know, we're seeing so many more legal arrivals coming into this country. But I don't think that Labour want to fix it or care. I think really, you know, the Conservatives and Labour, you know, have been, you know, two sides of the same coin on this issue. And as we've seen, actually, one other thing just that's come out in the figures today is that the settlement grants have been the highest that they've been since 2011. And that's what we're going to see now. In order to get indefinite leave to remain, you need to be in this country for 5 years. And we're actually going to see that those who have come since 2020 legally will start to have their settlement claims come here within the end of the next year. So I know there's been a push, some people suggesting that we should extend ILR to 10 years, certainly because with people thinking, well, we don't necessarily want these people in our country, and they have 5 years before they'll be able to get to stay here forever. So if the Labour government really wants to tackle mass migration, that's extending the indefinite leave to remain would be one move.
Now, of course, that's the broader set of migration, both legal and illegal. But to zoom in on the asylum issue that we're currently discussing, Jack, do you really think that the Labour Party doesn't want to deal with this? Of course, Starmer has made it one of his key pledges to smash the gangs. He's promised to close every single asylum hotel by the end of the Parliament. Do you not think that he believes his political survival rests on this issue, well, among many?
Yes, I think he would want to, quote unquote, smash the gangs. But that's not going to stop people coming over here and seeking asylum. I don't think that people in this country care whether they've come legally or illegally if they're committing crimes in their neighborhoods. They don't want these people here regardless of whether they've come across the boat in a small channel or whether they've been imported by the government by something such as the Afghan resettlement scheme. So even if small boat crossings are completely eliminated, we're still obviously subject to the UN Convention on Asylum, the European Convention on Human Rights, all of these things that still stop the government from being able to stop the flows at the border.
Okay,
anyway.
That's an interesting point. Let's throw it to Peter Edwards. Peter, it is true that only 39% of these figures of asylum applications actually come from small boats. The vast majority of those in this record number of asylum seeker, 111,000 number, come from people overstaying visas, holiday visas, work visas, student visas, and then claiming asylum.
Yes, I'm very glad you mentioned that point, because for reasons of political gain, the Conservative Party has deliberately confused all these groups into one and used disgusting phrases like people breaking into our country about asylum seekers, some of whose claims will be warranted, some of whose will not be. But the Conservatives tried to cloud the issue. And as Jack said, there are different cohorts of people. I actually think there is general public support for people who want to come here and work, providing they come through recognised entry routes. There's clearly no support for foreign criminals, and why would there be? But in the midst of all of that, there's asylum seekers. We've got a system that's far too slow. We've got a system that, to be frank, struggles to distinguish between the genuine and non-genuine. But personally, and I think most swing voters would feel the same, if you're fleeing a war-torn country, you deserve to be treated with respect and fairness. And of course, we mustn't forget fairness to the taxpayer as well. And that means having a system, probably of a few more staff, that works a bit quicker. And I think we're getting towards that.
What do you make of that, Jack, then? That there is public consent for a level of migration, but perhaps not the level that we've been seeing in recent years?
Well, see, the thing is that, there's a stat bandied around recently in that people think that legal and illegal immigration is about a 50-50 split, when actually legal immigration makes up about 96% of all immigration, and illegal makes about 4%. But at the same time, when you ask people, what do you think the inflow, the net migration into this country is, they'll put it at somewhere around 70,000, which is off by a factor of 10. And basically everybody in every cohort is in favour of reducing migration. Labour voters, Conservative voters, Reform voters, old, young, every demographic you can pretty much think of. So if they're off by a factor of 10, if they're underestimating the magnitude of immigration and they still think it's too high, I really don't think there is any appetite for this in the country. And just on asylum seekers as well, really, there are going to be hundreds of millions of people around the world who would qualify for asylum in this country. It is literally physically impossible for us to take us all in. We cannot take in all of these deserving
that is a good point, Jack. It is actually astonishing that the number one country that this 111,000, the number one nationality out of that 111,000 is Pakistan, which isn't a war-torn country in the sense that we would understand a war-torn country. It's a country that I wouldn't like to live in personally. It's less developed than the United Kingdom, but I mean, it's not an unsafe country in the traditional way that many people would understand it. If we think of Pakistan as an unsafe country, we've got to think of 2/3 of the world, perhaps 3/4 of the world as unsafe. And then that raises all sorts of questions about the rights of people moving here. Peter, I wonder if you would entertain the idea that not all migration is the same. That people generally did not mind 100,000 Hong Kongers coming to this country. People had no qualms with Ukrainians coming to this country. But that when it comes from, when we're looking at migration from cultures that are very, very different from the United Kingdom, from areas that are less developed, maybe even areas that have different attitudes towards women or the age of consent or the idea of consent in general, that's where we run into greater problems.
Well, there's two different things here. There's entering illegally and entering legally coming to work, and then there's genuine asylum claims. We've got to disaggregate all of those. Then there's a separate point, if you're here from a different country, far afield, about integrating with British values. Now, clearly, respect for women and respect for gay people is not universal in every country in the world, and we know that's generated some flashpoints quite rightly. But I think, to pick up on the other point very briefly about, you know, what the government going to do about it, and Keir Starmer, do they really care? I think they have to balance the traditional left thing of the dignity of the individual if they've come from a war-torn country, but also fairness to the British taxpayer. The bill is between 4 and 5 billion for asylum hotels, and pure political reality, because this is now a top issue up there with NHS and cost of living to the next election. So whether through kindness and altruism or pure political reality or economic fairness, I do think the government regard this as a #1 priority.
It's really, really interesting to see how communities have responded to this issue, as those hotels have created real flashpoints, real areas where people have been able to gather and protest. Jack, I know you've been at many of these protests and are sort of following this movement around the country. If all of these hotels go and people are moved into more dispersed accommodation, HMOs and the like, sort of peppered within a community rather than at one specific flashpoint, does that dilute that sort of protest movement you've been following?
I don't think it does. And as I said, there have already been, alleged incidents with HMO residents, and people therefore then campaign and protest outside the town council, for example. And, you could say that, you have a flashpoint with the community on the hotel, but then you could say, well, if these men are being scattered throughout the community, they're more likely to be, more people are more likely to encounter them in their daily life around there. So I do think that, this isn't a campaign against the asylum hotels specifically. It just happens to be the case that a lot of these incidents, alleged incidents, have come from people who are guests in these hotels. If they were guests or residents in HMOs, the reaction from the community would be exactly the same. These people don't want them in their community, whether they're in private housing or hotels or wherever. Frankly, they don't want them in this country at all.
Yeah, and as Peter mentioned, this billions upon billions of pounds bill is not looking pretty for the Chancellor as she faces that budget this autumn. But gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Peter Edwards, former editor of Labour List, and Jack Hadfield, a journalist who's been following this protest movement over the course of the summer. Thanks.